Hi all, welcome to MeDIDa, a podcast analysing all sorts of media about multiplicity and dissociative identity disorder. We're talking books, movies, television, gaming, and more. Whether it's overt or covert, intentional or unintentional, I want to talk about it. I'm your podcast host, Avodacat. I am a fully fused system, meaning that we used to be plural and now we are singular, and that's a process that happened gradually over time. And I am constantly intrigued by the way that media that isn't intentionally representing plurality almost always does a better job of it compared to media that is actively setting out to represent it explicitly. This podcast is not necessarily a place that is here to educate about DID, multiplicity, and plurality. There are many educational areas that you can look into, both online and offline, if you are interested in that. But this here is specifically to review and analyze media. So if you, like me, have opinions on things, stick around and join in the discussion. This podcast is recorded on Kaurna country, and I extend my respects to the traditional custodians of the land and the elders past, present, and emerging. Sovereignty was never ceded. This is still stolen land without any Indigenous treaty. The land I am on impacts how I go about my day-to-day life, including my media analysis, so this acknowledgement of country is important for the conversations we have here. Today, we will be discussing Elle's. That is Elle with an S in parentheses, like it's a little secret. This is a graphic novel trilogy by Kid Toussaint and Aveline Stokart that was published from 2021 to 2023. The series was originally written in French and then later translated into English. The English titles often lose something in translation, unfortunately, as the word plays work much better in French. The first book is called La Nouvelles in French, which translates just to The New Girl in English, and doesn't have that Elle's pun in it. The second book is called Universelles, and it's just translated to the Elle, and it is just translated to the Elle verse in English. And then the third book is Plurals, and it's translated to Elle together in English. So, we're already seeing that there's some lost in translation stuff happening here. The synopsis of the first volume is as follows. Elle is just another teenage girl. Most of the time. Bubbly and good-natured, she wastes no time making friends on her first day at her new school. But Elle has a secret. She hasn't come alone. She's brought with her a colourful mix of personalities, which come out when she least expects it. Who is Elle really? And will her new friends stand by her when they find out the truth? So if you are interested, if it sounds like something that you might like to read, then please do. During this discussion, I will be bringing up plot points, so if you would like a spoiler-free experience to develop your own opinions, check them out. They're relatively short books, they're graphic novels, and I was able to borrow digital copies from my library. So, based on the synopsis, Elle is quite clearly, intentionally depicting a plural experience. Right? Well, within the graphic novels, there are different versions of Elle that come out at different moments. There's a vast inner world, there's dissociation and amnesia between these switches, and there's little to no communication between the different parts internally at the beginning. From the jump, it seems like it's intentionally trying to tell a story about plurality, specifically a DID or OSDD story. However, looking further into this, I found a Reddit post discussing the fact that the authors deny that they were intentionally representing this experience, that the characters are purely an invention of fantasy and not meant to represent anyone's real-life experience. I have not been able to find anything straight from the source. I don't know French, and I can understand very little of what the authors put on social media, but given some of the later plot points in the series, I do feel inclined to believe that it was not their intention to write a realistic experience of plurality. So this media kind of sits in a weird place where the plurality is both explicit and intentional, while also kind of not being intentional, maybe? I personally only found out about the series recently. A Facebook group I follow, the Plural Association, created a post of community recommendations of plural media, and it was one of several on the list that I had not heard of that I also plan to cover. I also know that Brigade of Beans reviewed this on their YouTube channel last year, so I would recommend checking out that video if you would like. Now, I'm a big reader, but graphic novels have never been my favourite. I often find them visually overwhelming and confusing to follow in terms of action and who is speaking at any given time, and I found that this was also true for Elle's. Also, I found the pacing quite frustrating, with a lot of the important emotional moments feeling really rushed over and solved very quickly. There was also the translation aspect, which likely impacted the overall flow and experience of the writing. Now, I will admit that my issues with graphic novels are largely a me issue. A lot of people love graphic novels and don't have the same difficulties and frustrations that I do when reading them, so I'll do my best to not hold it against this piece of media. In a lot of ways, a graphic novel is a great form to get the story out there because it's more accessible to a lot of people, particularly younger audiences. And I did appreciate that this was not specifically a mature media like a lot of DID media tends to be. In the first volume, we meet Elle's 6 personalities, as the series calls them. The main way they are distinguished are their differing hair colours, and when they switch, the body's hair colour changes for the audience to visualise the switch, but this does not appear to be a literal visible change that the other external characters can see. So we have Rose, who appears to be the host. They don't use that specific language, but she is the main fronter throughout the series. And Rose is basically described as a regular teenage girl and a good friend. Additionally, we have Blondie, who is highly competitive and driven, Brunette, who is anxious, emotional, empathetic, and poetic, Violet, the jokester and highly imaginative, bigger-than-life type personality, and Green, the strong, silent type whose defining characteristic is literally not talking or engaging. At the end of the first volume, we see a cute little personality profile of these 5 personalities, which show off their different handwriting as well. I particularly like Green's. Hers made me laugh. We also see Blue in the first volume, who does not front within the first volume, as she seems to be locked up in the inner world, but planning her escape. When she does get out and begin fronting in the second volume, she is revealed as a selfish and manipulative personality. In the third and final volume, a 7th personality is also revealed, a male personality with white hair, known as White. This personality never fronts, but does talk to the other personalities in the inner world, while in a sort of dormant state, using a narrator-type speech bubble, and he knows a lot about how to navigate the inner world and what is going on in general. These personalities are very emotionally based and a bit two-dimensional, lacking a lot of individuality. They remind me a lot of Sanders' Sides, if you are familiar with Thomas Sanders' YouTube series. While a lot of people have also seen Sanders' Sides as a plural representation, that series is explicitly exploring, essentially, personified emotions, and not fully formed identities. I was hopeful in the first volume, particularly with the personality profiles we got to see, that the parts would become more developed as the story went on, but they actually seemed to get less defined and more one-note as the story went along. And while plurality can definitely include emotional parts that have not fully formed a sense of identity, for that to be all of the parts does not ring particularly true. For me, it also doesn't help that visually the only difference between the different personalities is the hair colour, as systems rarely have such identical looking parts in reality. It could possibly ring true for some OSDD systems out there, but again, I struggle to imagine that this was intentional from the authors. In a lot of ways, it is similar to my complaint about the United States of Tara, where the inner world alters were all still Toni Collette. Now, I get that it works for visual cohesion, and to be fair to Elle's, there is an in-universe explanation for this, but we will talk about that later. At the beginning of the first volume, Elle has moved to a new school and makes some new friends. Her core friendship group consists of Malis, who is friendly, observant, persistent, and level-headed, as well as Lynette, who is a little bit of an airhead, but in an endearing sort of way, Otis, a musician who's also a bit of a romantic, and Farid, who is sarcastic and vain and pretty queer-coded, if not overtly queer. Malis and Elle become very close quickly, and think of each other as best friends before too long, with Malis being the first of the friend group to notice something is up with Elle when she starts switching. After a while, the two have a heart-to-heart about it, and Elle shares some information, like how she was kicked out of her last school for hitting someone, and it didn't feel like her, but like she was watching someone else do it. To quote the first volume, "Actually, it wasn't really me. I mean, it was, but it's like I watched it happen from outside my body. It's like someone had taken possession of my body to hit Gilda." With Melis's help, Elle begins to map out her different personalities, and they also begin to discuss why she has different personalities, starting to poke at an origin story. While I overall liked aspects of this conversation with Melis, the way it all went down felt very rushed and lacking a lot of emotional resonance. This is something deeply personal to Elle, and something that might drive her friends away, but it's largely explained in just a very matter-of-fact way, and Melis just sort of accepts it with no real questioning. Additionally, in the next volume, the rest of the group is just aware of the presence of the different personalities. We don't get to see the rest of them learn about it or have any specific kind of reaction to it. There's no emotions, there's no disbelief or morbid curiosity, no well-meaning or misguided concerns, just nothing. Throughout the series, Otis is maybe even in a relationship with Elle, and there's not even a discussion about whether it's a relationship specifically with Rose Elle or with all the Elves, and nobody seems to care either. When Blue takes over and locks down the other personalities in Volume 2, Melis is the only one who is suspicious about this, while the rest of the group essentially just says, well, it must be our Elle, because it's not one of the other personalities she told us about, and maybe Elle is just a terrible person after all. It's just such an outrageously flippant attitude. It's just wild. Now, I'm not saying people can't have flippant attitudes towards plurality. Though usually I have found when people are flippant towards it, it's because they don't actually believe in it. It's rare for people to simultaneously be supportive and also flippant of something. It's an aspect of the series that I really don't vibe with. Elle also has tense relationships with her parents, and over the course of the series finds out that she was actually adopted. She meets and slowly develops a relationship with her birth mother, but it's a very surface-level relationship. We also find out that Elle's birth mother had her when she was very young and was originally wanting to keep her. For reasons unknown, she didn't end up keeping her, although at one stage she did try to take Elle back by kidnapping her as a baby. Elle's adoptive father explains that this is partly why her adoptive mother is always so anxious and combative, because she's always afraid of losing Elle. So there are aspects here that I really like. There is some real emotion and tension here, and it makes a lot of sense. But again, it all just feels very rushed. We don't get any time to delve into these things or let them breathe. It's part of the nature of how short the series is, how fast-paced graphic novels are, I guess, but it's just frustrating to me how quickly these emotional beats are rushed through. And then there's the origin story. Now, this is where things get weird, and part of why I believe the Reddit story that I read about the authors not intending this to be actual plural representation in any way. In Volume 2, when Elle meets her birth mother, it is explained that when she went in for her first ultrasound, the technician saw 6 embryos. This is later revised slightly, as when White is introduced, they explain that the technician got it wrong and there were actually 7 embryos initially. But over the course of the pregnancy, these embryos for some reason merged together until there was just a single baby that was born, who was Elle. And this in-universe explanation is the reason that Elle has multiple personalities, because they were supposed to be multiple people, but they merged together as one. So, I know this is a fantasy book series, and they are not intended to have real experiences mapped onto them, but I hate this. I really, really hate this. It's so deeply silly and nonsensical, particularly as this is a phenomenon that can happen. You often hear about people who absorbed their twin in the womb, but it doesn't cause split personality. There's also no reason given for why there was magically so many embryos, nor why they merged. Additionally, the reveal of this information feels like it comes out of nowhere, particularly as the fantastical elements in the series so far have been largely contained to Elle's inner world, even down to the hair colour changes, as it's implied that externally the characters are not seeing the hair colour changing. So for this leap of the fantastical magic from the inner world to the outer world, apropos of nothing, is just absurd to me. It just sort of sounds like a really weird lie that Elle's birth mother is telling her, and I actually would have had more respect for the series if that's the direction they chose to go in. To give the plotline some credit, the way that systems handle and justify their existence varies. Mentally, linking traumatic events to plurality is not something that usually occurs naturally, although traumatic experiences are some of the most common origin stories for plurality. To a young mind, the idea of literally being separate people trapped in a singular body because embryos merged in the womb is somewhat believable, and I can see a young system coming up with that sort of an origin story for themselves. And if that's the direction they took it in, with Elle finding out later that this was not actually accurate, I would be fully on board with it, particularly as it is revealed that Elle did go through traumatic situations as a young child. Even if the implication was for the system to be endogenic, meaning naturally occurring rather than traumatically caused, this multiple embryo thing is still not a good actual origin story. It's just nonsense. Elle's also kind of falls into the evil alter trope a little bit, but also sort of subverts it, so I'm not overly angry at it. In the first volume, Blue is locked away, and then in the second volume, she breaks free, takes over the body, and locks the other personalities out. It is revealed that she was locked away because the other personalities realized she was too toxic and they needed to keep her from fronting. And this appears to be true. Blue manipulates people and is incredibly selfish in her actions, borrowing money from her friends and not paying them back, and using them to gain new connections and popularity. Despite how threatening she is built up to be in the first volume, Blue ends up not being that bad overall. Is she an unkind person? Yes, but is she an evil alter? Not really, no. I'm not even sure that Blue could be considered a persecutor alter type, because she's not actively trying to cause harm to the system. She only locked them away to maintain control, not specifically to cause harm. She's really just a jerk more than anything. Sometimes alters are jerks, you know? They can't all be winners. In the third volume, right at the end, Elle fuses with her parts and forms one cohesive personality. This happens after all the personalities have gone through this sort of shared adventure in the inner world and passed through individual tests. The fusion is demonstrated in the inner world by all of them holding hands in a power of friendship type moment. Outwardly, this is shown through Elle's hair becoming a rainbow of colours rather than one solid colour. This happens right after all the personalities find White physically in the inner world after being guided to him by his subconscious voice. This is another moment that just felt way too rushed, and the emotionality of it did not hit at all for me. I can understand wanting this grand finale of everyone coming together, but it just felt flat. So firstly, as a fully fused system myself, I can pretty confidently say that holding hands in a circle in the inner world is not the way to do it. I will give them some credit. Internal communication was established. That's step one. They even showed that they were developing understanding and shared perspectives through that complementary colour streak in their hair. Green even has a whole emotional breakthrough, speaking for the first time ever in the series. But working towards full fusion is more than just one step or one conversation, more than just one breakthrough. All 7 personalities fusing all at once is also a tad unbelievable. I'm not going to say it's completely unheard of, just that I have not heard of it. Generally, fusion does not happen so instantaneously either. It can, but in my experience, it's usually a much more gradual process, and it doesn't always happen in a linear way. Sometimes 2 or 3 alters fuse and then later split again and other fusions happen. It's messy and takes time. Sometimes it can even happen without overt awareness of it. As parts become more open and communicative and share experiences together, co-fronting or being co-conscious together, sometimes it is something that is actively worked towards in therapy as well. And sometimes it just happens incidentally. There's a lot of different ways that fusions can happen. But this way is just a little too Care Bears and rushed to feel real. Emotionally, it didn't land because it didn't feel earned. Speaking of therapy, Elle sees a therapist a total of once throughout the series. In Volume 1, this single therapy session is attended by Green, the silent personality, so we get nothing! We don't even know if the therapist is aware that there are multiple personalities. It's fantastic! We do get some indication that therapy isn't helping all that much, and that Elle has been misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder. I do genuinely like this little detail, because misdiagnosis is incredibly common when it comes to multiplicity, particularly if we don't have the terminology to describe our experiences accurately. I was personally misdiagnosed with borderline personality disorder, despite the fact that I did not meet the threshold criteria for it. So personally, I'm glad for this little piece of representation there. There is an incident that occurs in Volume 3 that I think is handled so incredibly poorly. I think it is largely because of the pacing, but also it's just overall poorly written, in my opinion. Content warning here for discussions of suicide. Go to 24 minutes and 36 seconds to skip this section. Partway through Volume 3, Blondie pushes Brunette out into front after Brunette has expressed that she's never kissed anyone. Since Elle is kind of dating Otis, Blondie thinks that it is a perfect opportunity to get an easy first kiss for her. Brunette ultimately gets too anxious to go through with it and gets stuck in front because the rest of the personalities are on a whole mission in the inner world and unable to swap out. Going through the day, Elle's class is on a trip to the museum, and Elle's old school also happens to be there at the same time. Elle's old friend Gilda, the one she hit, which resulted in Elle getting kicked out of that school, is also there. Brunette and Gilda have a very short interaction, and Brunette gets very emotional about it. Malis, her main support, also leaves the museum trip early for a doctor's appointment. Otis happens to be at a different event that day, and Farid is hanging out with some other people, so Brunette is left with only Lynette for support, who isn't present enough to really realize anything is wrong. When Brunette gets home, she sees that Gilda has followed her on social media, and liked some of her posts. Brunette ends up scrolling through Elle's social media, spiraling and having a bit of an identity crisis because none of the posts are from her. This culminates in Brunette making a suicide attempt by taking a significant amount of sleeping pills, and Elle ends up in hospital. At this point, Green, sensing that something has occurred, forcibly switched with Brunette and remains fronting until the final fusion occurs at the end of the volume. As a concept, this is not a terrible idea, and it could be done well. It is a little extreme for the events of this day to culminate in a suicide attempt, but there are additional factors to consider, such as Brunette's tendency towards extreme emotions and the system's overall instability at this time, as they're opening communication channels and crossing into each other's spaces in the inner world, with a lot of different personalities coming to grips with their plurality for the first time ever. This is a storyline that could be done well, with nuance and care, as many systems struggle with suicidality and suicidal ideation. But sadly, I do not feel like it was done particularly well. It was not handled with particular care or with much nuance at all. Again, it suffers from feeling rushed, not sitting with any emotion for too long. Everything feels sudden, and the suicide attempt genuinely feels like it comes out of nowhere. Internally, Brunette doesn't get much time to come to grips with it either, immediately being whisked away on the adventure. Externally, Green takes over, which gives the external appearance of Elle shutting down, which, works well enough. However, Elle is almost immediately released from the hospital, which is just not very realistic after a suicide attempt. Or there's a time skip, I'm not quite sure, but if it's a time skip, it's not conveyed, and it would further contribute to the pacing issues I've been talking about. I really did not like the way that this was handled, and I wish it had not been included at all given how poorly it was done. Particularly when comparing it to the overall tone of the series, as well as going back and forth between these scenes and the internal, lighthearted adventure of the inner world, the tonal whiplash here is just wild. This moment is not strong enough to land emotionally, and does not fit with the tone set by the rest of the story, and I just do not think it should have been included. It was irresponsible to include this. I do think that the internal world is the strongest point of this series. I like that each personality has their own space and that they're all separated from each other. For many systems, this will ring true of their own headspace, while others may have a fully shared inner world. Usually there's some sort of mix between shared spaces and completely segregated spaces. So I like that there is segregated spaces for each of the personalities, especially considering that when the series begins, the personalities are completely unaware of each other for the most part, and so being completely separate in the inner world makes sense. There is also a disconnect between memories when in the inner world versus when fronting, which is definitely a thing that can happen in many systems for many reasons. Rose seems to be aware of things in the inner world that she is unaware of when fronting, which sort of represents part of the protective mechanism of dissociative amnesia to protect the system from recognizing that it is a system and allow apparently normal functioning. So, each personality has their own space. Blondie has a tropical island where she basically stars in her own personal version of Survivor. Green has a lazy swamp river that she can quietly row down. Rose has an isolated diner cafe type situation. Violet is driving a spaceship deep in space, exploring the universe. Brunette is in a snowy, quiet woods. And Blue is locked in her little prison cell. Eventually, we do get to see what I think is Blue's actual area, which appears to be this sort of like meadowy nature area. I find this interesting, and it definitely leaves more questions about who Blue is that we don't get answers to. White doesn't have an area at all. He's sort of in a state of dormancy. When the other personalities go to wake him up from dormancy, they approach a big egg in Blue's area and literally pull him out of it. This is probably unintentional, but it is kind of funny given he is the only male in the system. I genuinely love the vastness of the inner world, how big each of the spaces are, and as much as the art style of Elle's isn't really my favourite, I do love how it looks for the inner worlds. I also like that the inner world can be manipulated, as Blue does manipulate the inner world as part of her plan to escape. Inner communication is only made possible when one personality traverses to another personality's world, essentially breaking down the barriers between the parts. Rose does this in Volume 2, while trying to get back to front when Blue has locked them all in. In this process, Rose learns more about the system and gains different coloured streaks in her hair to represent the opening of communication between her and the other personalities, which I do like as a visual indicator. I do think that this happens very quickly, but I've already talked a lot about my issues with the pacing. We get to see these areas again in Volume 3, when Rose is collecting all the personalities in order to free White. While on this adventure, we get some background information that Rose is regaining some memories about how she and Green originally locked Blue away. This is told through dialogue between Rose and White, in his dormant subconscious narrator state. As much as I like the regaining of memories moment, I do wish it had been done differently. I mean, you've got this visual medium of a graphic novel, so why are you telling me something through dialogue when you could be visually showing it to me? There are so many ways you could visually indicate a flashback like that. Also, Green is a almost completely silent personality, but Rose doesn't really go into any detail about how they made this decision or even discuss the situation, or why these two specific personalities were the ones that made the decision. And I just am so curious about the details of it all, and we get nothing. There's just so much missing in this moment, and it is deeply frustrating to me. Even though I would say that the majority of the trilogy is spent in the inner world, I still feel like I wanted more of it and a more in-depth internal communication process. Again, overall, I feel like there's a pacing issue in this series. So whether or not Elle's intended to be a representation of actual plurality, it is hard to deny that it is plural representation. There are multiple personalities inside Elle's mind, they confront to control the body, there are memory barriers and mental barriers between their inner worlds, and it has a significant impact on their day-to-day life. Having this media in the form of a graphic novel where adolescents and young adults are the target audience is also pretty fantastic for representation in my opinion, as it makes this sort of experience more accessible for younger people who are not generally able to engage in the more mature medias that usually depict DID, or even just for people that don't want to engage in that more mature media and prefer this more lighthearted style of story. It opens up an avenue to explore these ideas, which I think is fantastic. It being a short graphic novel series is also to its benefit, as it would be relatively easy for someone to read the whole series in just a day. On the other hand, I do wish it had been more fleshed out and overall just done better. Because the line that the series walks of incredibly relatable to the lived experience of systems and completely made up nonsense makes this series border on harmful misinformation. I think the first volume is probably the best, but as the story progresses in the second and third volume, it really gets let down by some of the choices made. Overall, I give Elle's a 3.25 out of 5 for multiplicity representation in media. I know it's such a specific number, but I have a lot of very specific feelings about this. I had such high hopes for the series when I first heard about it, and I was genuinely so let down. On the one hand, I am glad it exists, and I'm glad that people have found it very useful and a good representation for them. On the other hand, this series feels like it's trying to start a new harmful set of misinformation tropes within plural media, and that is deeply frustrating to me. But what do you think? Have you read Elle's? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Do you disagree with me completely? Or do you agree with me? I would love to know. If you have any comments or suggestions for topics to cover on MeDIDa, or if you would like to be a guest on an episode, you can contact us on MeDIDapodcast@gmail.com. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel, Avodacat, where I will be uploading episodes of this podcast. And if you want to leave a comment on those videos, I can also respond to you there. I've been Avodacat. This has been MeDIDa, and it is time to switch out.